So now we have our text area, and that's still not a lot of room to type. You can see very quickly you run out of room. So why don't we set a width and a height? And there's two ways to do this. One is to apply it within your markup. So you could go right here to the text area and you could specify rows and calls. And you can think of these the same way you would think of in a spreadsheet. For example, rows will be the number of horizontal rows. If I set that to a big number like 50, that's a huge number of rows. Why don't we bring that down to 20? If it's easier, think of calls equals width, rows equals height. And I'll change that to 30. And now we've given them a lot more room to enter their comment. Now there's one problem with this. You can do this, but then again, what if you decide down the line that you want to change the width and height of that text area? We do that big no-no again where you would then have to go back to your markup and adjust it. Another way we can do this is apply a width and height directly to the text area within our CSS, like so. Let's see how that looks. Refresh, and now we're getting more or less the same effect, but we're doing it all from within our CSS file. Now I think that height is too much, so I will reduce that and increase the width to 400, and that's looking a lot better. So now we can enter some information, my comment here, and if I click go, watch what happens, and pay attention to the URL right here. Click go, and nothing happens. Why? And it's because we've overwritten the default method. And when it's post, you're not going to be able to see it because the data is not transmitted through the URL. If we change it to get, it will. Reload the page, and once again, my name, my comment, and now look at the URL. It's been updated. Notice that we specify it what we call a query string. At the end of the URL, there's a question mark, and then the input's name equals the value that was provided. And you separate each input with an ampersand. So name equals Jeff, comments equals my comment. And it's getting the word name and comments directly from the values that we provided, right here and right here. So notice that because we set the action to nothing, it submits to the current page. If we instead wanted to set the action to context.php, and if we came back and entered this information again, it's then going to try to load contact.php, and it's going to take the information that was entered into that form and send it through the URL. And then, presumably with a server-side language, you would capture those values and then maybe email an administrator or perform some kind of action, maybe add that information to a database. This is the essentials of working with a form. Now in this case, again, we're not working with a server-side language. We're going to leave the action blank. So let's take a look at a couple more things before we finish up for the day. And I hope you're working along because it'll really make it stick if you are. What if we want to give the user a yes or no type question? In that case, we can use a checkbox. We'll create a label, and this will say CSS. And we'll say, do you like CSS? Now, once again, we get to use an input element, but we specified the type to be checkbox. Now we have to remember to apply a name of CSS, or more importantly, an ID. You can usually get away with removing the name, although it is required in some situations. Now if I reload the page, we have a label and we can click on it. So watch what happens when I add my name and I check this and I click go. You'll see that it is represented by the value on. CSS equals on, and that means it was checked. But watch what happens if I do it again, and this time I leave it off. Notice that we have name equals Jeff, comment equals nothing because nothing was added, but we have no mention of this checkbox right here. And that's because when it's not checked, it will not be posted or sent through the URL. And that's an important distinction to make. It's not going to say CSS equals off. There is no off, only on. And I also want you to note that in addition to clicking on the checkbox, because the label is associated with it, which we did right here for CSS, we can click on the label and that will trigger that input or check it. So it makes sense that we should also make the label element, and we change the cursor to a pointer, and that will change it to that little finger. And that gives a little more feedback that it is clickable. And if you want to do a little bit more, maybe we make the color blackish, and we'll set the font family to sans serif, and maybe we set a little padding below so there's some breathing room between the label and the input, and we'll say 8 pixels just to clean it up a little bit more. And you can see now you're building a good form. And let's do one more before we finish up for the day. What if you want to give the user a list of options? So what is your favorite X? We'll do it right here within a list item. And our label will be favorite language. And here we're going to create, once again, another input. And this time the type is going to be radio. And if I reload this quickly, you'll see now we have a radio button. But this is different from a checkbox in that you can't click it again to uncheck because it's expected that you have to choose one. So generally you'll have things like CSS. If I reload, can you see that show up? And I'll repeat this a couple times. You'll want to make sure that you add, just as before, a name and an ID. I'm going to leave that blank for now because you know that you're supposed to do that. JavaScript, and the last one maybe Ruby. Reload, and now we have a list of items. So you can click one or more. Now it's important to note again, you cannot uncheck a radio button once it's been checked. If you want to give them that ability, maybe you should be using a checkbox instead. Reload. Note I can click HTML, but no matter how many times I click it here, I can't remove it. All right, so good job. You've created your first form, and this is how anyone would create a static form. In the next lesson, I'm going to teach you about image replacement.